Sophie goes to a bank manager and says, please, could I have a bank account? And he says, and I remember this so well, Ollie, when I went to university, he says, yes, of course you can have a bank account, but you've got to have the signature of your husband or your father or even your brother.
Hello. In today's episode, we hear from a wonderful writer, Elizabeth Buchan. She's been at the top of her game now for many years and has recently written 2 books that take the reader to post-war France and Italy, with both countries dealing with the trauma of World War II. In the French case, it's collaboration, and with Italy, the rise of communism. Elizabeth was in publishing prior to her writing career, so we'll hear stories of her involvement with writers such as Dirk Bogarde and V.S. Naipaul. Links are in the show notes, including her bestseller that she talks about, The Revenge of the Middle-Aged Woman. So what better name for the episode than that? Coming up, it's the anniversary for the Battle of the Bulge, so Gordon and Philip join for a 2-part special starting Saturday. If you have any comments and you use Spotify, go ahead and stick them in. I'm always happy to hear from listeners, but until then, I'll hand you over to me talking with Elizabeth Buchan and The Revenge of the Middle-Aged Woman. Elizabeth, a real pleasure to have you on. Thank you very much for joining me.
Oh, this is great, Ollie. I'm delighted.
Well, you were going to be on for a group discussion we had, but it was all terribly last minute, and that was with Jane Thin,
That's right.
Paul Lay, and Miranda Mallon. So I'm glad I've finally got you because we can talk about a few things about fiction in the past. Well, that was quite an amusing discussion, actually. So there was one particular area I'm very keen to speak to you about, but we'll leave that to the end of the conversation.
Okay.
But really, it's good to have you on to talk about. I mean, I know you've just had a novel out in the summer called Bonjour Sophie.
That's right. That's right. And
And
it'll be paperbacking in April, so the publishing process continues.
right, okay. Well, I thought it'd be good for the listeners to just if you just explain exactly what not exactly, well, otherwise we'd be here all day, but the storyline behind Bonjour Sophie, because there are a few themes that I'd quite like to talk to you about from it.
Okay.
So it's set, I think we're in sort of Sussex, aren't we? End of the 50s.
Yes, it is. It begins in Sussex in 59 and sort of ends up in 1960, which I sort of chose, I suppose, as a turning point, in particular for women's lives. And it focuses on an orphan who is French. Her pregnant mother came over during the war and gave birth, and her father was killed in the resistance. So she's brought up by this rather reprehensible vicar and his wife in Sussex, and various things happen to her, and she decides to try and get back to Paris and where she came from, and to find out about her history and how she came to be in Sussex as a baby. And I sort of wanted to meld that with the changing attitudes towards women, because for example, Sophie goes to a bank manager and says, please, could I have a bank account? And he says, and I remember this so well, Ollie, when I went to university, he says, yes, of course you can have a bank account, but you've got to have the signature of your husband or your father or even your brother, if that's okay. And I thought the difference between then, 59, 60, although I hasten to say I didn't go to university in
Well, no, I mean, I was going to say you were opening a bank account in the 90s.
no, this was at least 10 years later when I was going to university. And the difference between then and the attitudes now and the progress we've made as the female contingent within a society and the rights and rules and regulations that apply to us is quantum difference. So I was just very interested in that point of change.
Yes, I suppose. Well, obviously, you get women's liberation in the 60s. Is it the pill that's the key moment? When did the pill come in?
Gosh, do you know, I think that probably came in about mid-60s, do you think?
Yeah,
Yeah, something like,
yes.
yes, that must have had an enormous sort of momentum about women and how they conducted their lives and what they did with them and what they did with their sexuality. But there were other important things too, like your finance. I mean, you weren't allowed to have a mortgage at one point until quite late on.
I
You
would have
could
thought
have a vote, but you
yeah,
could
if you can have the vote, you should be
have
able to get a bloody
very
mortgage.
easily or take on a leasehold. So those are rather important sort of considerations in a life, particularly if you were trying to make your way with a career in a city or something like that. Had as much, well, had equal weighing, I think, as well as the sexual liberation. And also cultural attitudes. People began to change in the way that they looked at females and their roles. And if you've ever read the wonderful Virginia Nicholson's book about women in the 50s and how after the war, the efforts that had been made by them as working people were sort of rescinded. They went back into the homes and said, look, we've got to be homemakers. So it was the beginning all over again, really. And Sophie is part of that change in social attitude, that push forward to make lives on on an independent basis.
So Sophie would be born in about 41 then, would she?
41, yeah.
Right. Okay. So and then so she's been living with a vicar in the
Yes.
50s. So that's austere Britain in the
Austere
50s
Britain,
in an austere household.
very austere house. Did you ever read Lorna Sage's Bad Blood, the wonderful memoir?
No, and you've mentioned the
Her
Virginia
upbringing.
Nicholson. I haven't read either, to my
Oh,
shame. We should
that is
put
a
links. I'm
mistake.
making a note of
And
these so
I
we can put links in.
pay tribute to Lorna Sage's Bad Blood because it inspired my picture of this vicar and his wife, uh, who sort of lived on the margins of penury, but had a social role in the village, i.e., you were there as the moral arbiter and you were free to preach sort of hell and brimstone if the villagers didn't obey the religious precepts and the Christian theology. On the other hand, your own personal life was slipping quite a lot and you were prey to sort of urges and desires that were not at all acceptable or proper for a vicar. And Sophie finds this, and that's part of, I think, as much as anything else, apart from the social and cultural education that Sophie gets, it's the sentimental education that she's involved in, how she discovers these sides to society and human nature, weighs them up, and then continues on with her life hoping that there's a balance there, knowing these things, that innocence is very much a commodity perhaps of childhood, and losing it, but losing it doesn't necessarily have to be a tragedy.
And with the fire and brimstone
Yeah,
of the foster father, the
yeah.
vicar, is that he's not Presbyterian though, it's Church of England or
Church of England, you must behave, you will be punished. And I remember there were sermons like that as a child in the village. I
yeah, I
was,
remember them at school actually, but that was probably
yes,
because we were
yes,
all naughty
actually, it's school.
schoolboys. Yeah,
Right, yeah.
yeah.
It was a very useful tool for sort of cultural and sort of behavioural cohesion, wasn't it? It's loosened its grip now, and some may say for the worse, but it's certainly it was very draconian very often, not always, of course. There was great love and affection by many clerics for their flock, but it
A little
worked.
bit too much in some
Yeah.
cases. Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Say naming no names. Yeah.
No, no. No, it's interesting that. Yes. Yes, I always wonder about. The thing is, now I've got rather a sentimental view of the Church of England in that I don't go, but I like that it
Yeah.
exists.
Yes, and I think it's been, well, how could you possibly argue otherwise? So very important in so many lives for so long. The fact that it's undergoing some kind of rethinking and reconstituting of its arena, if you like, is a good one and happens all the time. Think of Henry VIII and his Reformation. I mean, I know it was a change from Catholic to what became the Church of England, but those kind of reformations are important and have always happened.
Well, Sophie decides to sort of basically discover her past, doesn't she? When
She
she
does. She goes back to Paris and goes to an agency which specializes in finding lost people from the war, because one of the things that characterized the post-war years was people searching, particularly in Europe, for members of the family or whoever, had friends even, had disappeared during the sort of chaos. Because if you, again, and to cite Keith Lowe's Savage Continent, which I know you,
Yes.
I think you know,
Yes.
he talks about and describes so brilliantly the feralness of the continent after the war. And a lot of people had disappeared, and there were great sort of pilgrimages of displaced Germans going back to Germany, and people had disappeared in the camps and were still being held there, or had disappeared because they wanted to. And so she goes to this bureau which specializes in that and says, please find out about my father, who she didn't know, who the only thing she knew about her father was he was killed during the liberation of Paris. And in her researches, she finds out about the Marais quarter where she's living and working, and how it had been Jewish and then stripped of the Jews who were sent off, what was happening to it now, the kind of redevelopment that was planned for it, but luckily wasn't actually instigated, because it would have involved pulling down all those old buildings in the priceless old and wonderful buildings in the Marais, but also the kind of resistance operations that went on there during those years of occupation. And again, as the sentimental education as well as the historical and cultural one, where she finds out that her father was a hero in one sense, but he wasn't in another. And he had died defending France and his resistance group. On the other hand, he'd had to live, and he'd, like a lot of French or anybody under occupation, I don't wish to castigate the French, because I'm sure we would have been the same over here. He had done things that she didn't consider quite moral, but had to think about. So once she's discovered who she is and how her father died and what he did, it presents the opportunity for her to have a sort of resolution. And that is really what the novel is about, her arriving at the resolution and finding out that she will stay in France. Stay.
Ah, one. Well, that's one. Paris in the 60s. Did you do a bit of research as to see what that
I
was
read
like?
a little bit, and it was, somebody said it was like it needed a lot of plastic surgery, France, but nobody had told the surgeon. and, and, um, but the authorities were getting their act together and were putting together the sort of the Paris that we now know, and getting rid of the rubble and the destruction, the parts that had been under destruction. Not quite the same as the Blitz, obviously, the effects of the Blitz over in London and elsewhere in England. But yes, it was beginning to be the Paris, and there was a great will to get it there, I think. It had an optimism about it and a busyness about it. And anybody who went there sort of remarked on that. So it was very much a city resurgent, a phoenix, really.
I don't know if you've read, because I find the French experience of the war so interesting when you see what their view on it is today. So I
Yeah,
don't know if you've read. It's a very good. About a year ago, I read France on Trial, the
I've
book
heard,
by
yeah.
um, I've forgotten his name now. Historian Julian Jackson,
Uh-huh. No, I
and
haven't. No.
all about Marshal Pétain being
Yeah.
put on trial after the war for,
Well, there's
well,
sort of
treason.
the what they call the purging of France afterwards was pretty horrible, but probably very necessary, because it was a sort of cathartic process. Probably very unfair in some respects. I don't know. I haven't looked at all the cases, but and it was very unfair for the women, a lot of them who had slept with Germans, probably possibly in order to keep themselves and their family going, and the treatment that were meted out to them, and the political figures were rightly put under sort of the microscope, and some of them were rightly castigated and and punished. Yeah.
Yeah, but so the female, the response to women after the war, then this is really horrific. They're kind of had their head shaved and
You see the most horrific photos of them having their head shaved very roughly and then being paraded with practically nothing on through the jeering crowds. possibly quite a lot of those crowds had been up to the same kind of thing, but weren't going to reveal it. So it was a very mixed time. It was justice en gros, wasn't it? It wasn't judicial justice. It was justice of the people, and that can go so badly wrong. So you have to be very, very careful.
Yes, absolutely. Another book, which I think is how we first got sort of talking, was your previous to this,
Yeah.
Two Women in Rome,
Oh, yes.
which it's also very interesting. This is also post-war, but it's just sort of the reaction, the war sort of looming over both books, really, isn't it?
Yes, this was Rome post-war, where the Americans, who obviously had a great interest in the continent, particularly the Western Europe, were terrified the communists were going to take over, and left small sort of paramilitary units, which they'd armed. So there were little arms dumps all over the place in the Western European countries, and in particularly in Rome, where the communists had made great headway in the north of Italy, in particular, and they were very efficient, the communists. And there was a great battle going on between the communists and the non-communists in the Italian parliament, which resulted in, well, ex-Prime Minister Moro being kidnapped by allegedly the Red Brigades, and then subsequently killed, which caused international consternation. There is some evidence to suggest, and there's somebody called Daniel Ganser who wrote a big book about it, saying actually what it was the CIA had planted people in the Red Brigades who had instigated this kind of activity, because there were also bombings as well as the killing of Moro, in order to turn public opinion against the left, in order that the right would be, it's very complicated, be propped up, and the communist threat would recede from Italy. So I was writing about that via the eyes of a modern contemporary woman who'd gone to work in the records of the sort of archives, the Roman archives for the foreigners in Rome, because Rome has always been a magnet for foreigners. And she discovers the papers of a girl who'd been working undercover in order to work out what was going on with the CIA, what was going on with what they call the Gladio, these units that had been planted in societies by the CIA, and how the two sort of met in terrible sort of tragedy, really, for a lot of people. And it's an uncovering of this past, which sort of added, I suppose. I got very fascinated by the layers that surround Rome. And this was another layer, these years, what they called the years of lead, while all this activity with the CIA against the communists were going on.
I had no idea that the CIA were. I mean, I obviously knew the CIA were active,
And
but
I'll probably get shot when I leave the house because it's top secret. But, but
it doesn't surprise me. They were up to no good all over the world.
they
It
were
was sort
up
of.
to no good all over the world, and they were really, really obsessed by the rise of communism. I mean, and it wasn't just Italy; it was places like Belgium and France and other places. They were working hard to make sure that this didn't happen.
I remember reading a book about post-war Italy. I can't remember the title now, but I know on the front cover of your book you have a little Fiat 500, and the this is the original one. If in case listeners are thinking it's the new one, it
Yeah,
isn't. And that vehicle was the main reason for Italy not going communist, because it was an affordable vehicle for anyone, and so it was freedom, and it was, the
yeah.
sort of
Yeah, well, you can see
capitalism.
that now that you've said it, Ollie. It's so obvious, isn't it? It's like the Volkswagen with Volkswagen Beetle for Germany, really. Yeah,
Yes, yes, absolutely. I mean, this period of post-war Italy, Red Army factions, and
yeah,
now like with this element of the CIA, this is a absolutely kind of. I think in this country, okay, we've dealt with Irish terrorism up
yeah,
until
yeah,
'98, but in Italy, I mean, also Germany with the Baader Meinhof as
yeah,
well.
yeah. Yeah.
I find it extraordinary.
It's an
There was
element in human nature and an offshoot of society, I suppose, that will never go away. It'll always be there. It'll transform itself. It'll have metamorphoses according to the era and the kind of political situation. Always there. And it's always there to be mined by the novelist, I think.
Hello, Ollie here. Please forgive my interruption, but I wanted to let you know that at Aspects of History, we produce a digital magazine featuring articles, interviews, short stories, and book reviews of the best historical writing available. Authors featured including Ben Macintyre, Lucy Worsley, Andrew Roberts, and plenty more. An annual subscription is available for only $9.99. That's pounds or dollars. Yep, you heard that right. That's 6 issues for under £10 or dollars. Head over to aspectsofhistory.com to subscribe, where you can also gift subscriptions since Christmas is coming. Now back to the show. I mean, you're straying into sort of espionage territory.
Well, I got interested, but a couple of my novels were about the SOE. And I wrote one years ago called Light of the Moon, which was about a girl training as in F section and going off and finding a relationship with a German officer. And I got stick for that, obviously. But it was based on the fact that my aunt married a German immediately after the war. And I always struck me that these things these relationships never have sort of barriers, really, and they cross them despite terrible things like the war happening. Anyway, I did a lot of research for that, and I was lucky enough to meet Francis Camert before he died and ask him about life as an undercover operative, which was completely fascinating. And I remember one of the things I asked him is, how did you make yourself face every day? And he said, well, it was a composition of boredom with extreme terror. And I said, well, what was the worst thing that was characterized that kind of life? He said, well, I had to pretend to be a French farm worker. He said, and in order to be authentic, I had to drink at least 2 litres of red wine before lunch. He said, it nearly killed me. So it's those little details that sort of got me interested in the sort of subversive life. And novelists are interested in the subversion under the formal picture. There's always another one in negative going on somewhere.
Yes, I was very lucky to speak to William Boyd last week.
Ah,
When he was explaining how, yes, well, the similarity, I think he was saying that novelists and spies have that in common.
absolutely. I think completely right. Yeah.
So you've been writing. I was looking into this. What was your Consider the Lily? Was that your first novel?
No, that was my third. I wrote one. The first one was called Daughters of the Storm, which was sort of love and lust in the shadow of the guillotine. But and it was also the novelist's first novel, the rookie novel. And because I thought I knew everything about the French Revolution by the time I'd finished it, I thought that you, the reader, should know. So I did stuff it with a lot of facts. But and I do remember pulling my poor husband around the way of the tumbrils. I think that was a nadir in our relationship. But, but anyway, so and no, Consider the Lily was my third one, and the second one was the SOE one, Light of the Moon, and it was lucky enough to win a prize, Consider the Lily, and I sort of went from there. Yeah, and when I started out, I was very interested in the historical novel, but I realized that you needed experience of writing a novel and you needed experience of reading and thinking about the past that I didn't have at that point. So I confined myself to, and also I was bringing up young children, and my interests and energies were really in the domestic arena. So I wrote a few novels about the domestic arena and focused on that while I thought about how to think about writing historical novels and how to accumulate more experience, if you like, on how to deal with facts, on how to thread them through into a story. And I found that very fascinating, but it took a few years. So in between the first historical novels and the ones I'm writing now, there was books about the domestic arena, including one called The Revenge in the Middle-Aged Woman,
Ooh.
which sort of went all around the world. I think it was the title, Ollie, and and I got letters from all around the world because it was about the story of a woman picking herself up after her husband had left her for a younger colleague, and I took it from the aphorism, the Spanish aphorism, which was "living well is the best revenge." So I have her living well at the end of all this, and I got masses of sort of emails from people in Europe, and I treasure one from a Polish lady who said, "You have made a woman's of me." So I felt the novel had succeeded. I felt.
That must be amazing to receive, emails like that.
Yeah, it is wonderful actually, and I treasure
Yeah.
it.
It's interesting how you describe honing your kind of style to be able to write sort of historical
I
novels
do
set in the
think it is.
past.
I'm not denigrating modern novels or
No, no,
contemporary.
no, I didn't
No, not at
wasn't
all.
trying to
Uh,
suggest you were.
no, but I do think there is a special dimension about writing the historical novel that one's got to pay attention to. And there are lots of fantastic practitioners. I mean, gosh, real sort of role models to follow.
Well, Hilary Mantel, is she one?
Gosh, yeah. And it's something that has to be taken sort of reasonably seriously. I mean, you don't have to write a serious book necessarily, but you have to write, the writing of it has to be serious. And I think you are not doing the right thing if you don't think about it quite hard.
Do you mean, are you getting at the fact that you need to sort of place yourself as someone who's in the past and therefore, you don't have the baggage of them being
You
living
really have to
today?
discard the agency that you will carry, and you won't be able to get rid of it entirely. Of course you won't. But you do have to make that really effortful, imaginative leap to be in the mind of people. For example, if you're writing, dare I say it, Tudor novels, um, where religion sort of directed your life, or your beliefs directed your life in a way that they probably don't these days, or for a lot of people they don't. And for me, I find that really takes up sort of blood, sweat, and tears. You really have to think your way back and really think, how would that mental process of a character manifest itself when you have those kind of contexts, and when you're brought up in that kind of period. It is different from now, and one has to acknowledge it.
Absolutely, yes. The past is a foreign country, and it's interesting. We were talking about our books of the year midway through the year on this podcast with Antonia Senior, who mentioned Bonjour Sophie, and how you
Oh,
do. Yes, you must. We must. I'll send it to you if you haven't heard it.
Dick, how lovely.
Um, but she does mention how we were talking in the context of, my particular bugbear is rewritings of the Greek myths where, you know um, women all of a sudden become, it's like ignoring what's in the myths already, where you get many strong female characters, and then the blurb on the back is reimagining the myth, and the female hero becomes, it sort of removes all subtlety and becomes a powerful figure,
Yeah,
but one that is quite clearly a modern day woman, well aware of rights and all that kind of thing, which
yeah,
just doesn't sit well with the
just
past. And I
wouldn't
think
be.
Antonia was saying that you capture that kind of the awareness of the area that the character is in, and not the character
Yeah,
that
well,
we're
oh, that's
in.
very wonderful. That's what I've been trying to do. The authenticity of thought and behavior is what is really important. Yeah.
You've been writing for what, sort of 30 years then?
I think it must be. I haven't done a count, Ollie, but I used to write blurbs for Penguin Books, and I ran the office there for quite a long time while I was having my babies. And they paid you to put your feet up on the desk and read through the books. So I became a bore because I could talk about A Woman's Guide to Socialism, or the new science of strong materials, because or Japanese basket work. And, but it was the most extraordinary education. I am so grateful for it. And you met a lot of the authors, and we're in touch with a lot of authors. I remember writing to Kingsley Amis after he won the Booker Prize to congratulate him. And he said, well, he was going to spend the money on buying curtains. So, so you had all those lovely little moments, really.
That's a bit disappointing. I thought Kingsley Amis would spend his money on
Oh,
something more.
booze. Yeah,
Yeah.
we probably did. I don't know.
Who
Like,
are some of the other authors that you work with?
well, I remember Dirk Bogarde ringing up. He was writing novels at that point, and he said, "Darling, I'm at the Ritz, and life is a bitch, and it's raining. What am I going to do?" And then he said, "You've sent me this blurb for his novel," and I was quite early on in my sort of writing career there, I think, and I'd said something really from anodyne, like he's a writer writing at the top of his form, and he said, "Darling, if I'm at the top of the form, where else do I have to go?" And I realised, I'd pulled that down from central casting, and it taught me that every word has to earn its place. It really does. You can't do that. You have to think very carefully about context and about vocabulary and about where they go and how they appear and their order. And I thank him for that very much.
Yes,
Very,
that's interesting because the blurb is, well, it's on the back cover. You
yeah,
can't miss it. It's the first
yeah,
thing that everyone turns to, unlike within, 250 pages. Not that that doesn't have to be perfect for an author
yeah.
as well, but the blurb, writing the blurb, there must be a lot of pressure on that.
Yes, and people got very angry, and you were at the bottom of the publishing chain. So if anything went wrong, editors, sales, marketing came in and slagged you off. So whenever I hired someone, I gave them a box of tissues, and that sat in their desk, because sometimes it could be quite helpful, but at other times people were extraordinarily nice, and authors could be extraordinarily nice. I remember Iris Murdoch writing to me and saying, blurb writing is a mini art form. I think I've still got the letter somewhere. So, it wasn't exactly a roller coaster, but it was mixed experience, and that was fascinating. Oh, I remember actually, V.S. Naipaul took me out to lunch, and he said, I don't know why he did actually, but he said, "Now, to what does the slave aspire?" And I, idiotically young, sort of nervous, sort of said in a very Tigger voice, "To be free." And he said, "Don't be so ridiculous. The slave aspires to be the master." And that was another lesson. I hope I haven't misquoted him. My memory hasn't, misled me. But I remember thinking, gosh, that's another lesson learned.
Yes, wow, that's extraordinary. How has publishing changed, do you think, in all the years? We were talking about it with Jane, and Jane was talking about, I think Jane had been told off, not told off, but she had I think a sensitivity reader in America had complained that the Nazis
That's
were
right.
fat.
I think publishing has changed a lot. It was a very much more luxurious in the sense of authors were allowed to develop. They had time to do so. In when I first went into Penguin, publishing paperbacks were Penguin was unto itself, and it bought in its books to make into paperback from other publishers. When Peter Mayer, the big sort of publishing hero saint, um, divisive figure, came in and took over Penguin, he said, right, editors, we must buy in more hardback companies, and you must buy in order to push in an integrated way the book down into the paperback list. So it became much more integrated, and it was the beginning of the conglomeration of the publishing houses, which then took enormous sort of energy to run. And there was less energy and money, I think, people may dispute this, with which you could allow to develop an author, particularly novelists, and give them time and space to develop. And I think that sort of bottom line attitude is much more prevalent today. Now, that's an obvious thing to say, but I think it is true. I think it is true. And it has its fallout, really. There is much more emphasis on quick returns. And you can't blame publishers for that. It's a very expensive life. It's a very expensive operation for a project that probably doesn't cost very much in the grand scheme of things, and is expensive to produce and market. And the margins drop all the time too, with the advent of the abolition of the net book agreement did a lot of damage, I think, and reduced the margins in a way that big publishers had to really, really think about. And thus you can see why they rely on celebrity publishing to bring in the big sales and the bigger margins. So it's a different kind of landscape. It's not to say it won't change again, but it's quite a harsh and tough one at the moment, particularly for that dreaded category, the middleist author, who may achieve one or two novels, and then if they're novelists, or one or two books on non-fiction subjects, and then are told actually perhaps not anymore in future. So whereas
Yes.
they might have been allowed a bit more leeway in the past in order to build a name, a brand, a recognition by the reading public. So it is different, yeah.
Well, happily, you're not in that category, and so how much? So you're presumably writing one at the moment.
I am. I've got to deliver it by Christmas. So,
I
or
see. Right. Well, we better hurry up on this conversation. What is your next book about?
well, it's called Love Times Three. And it's about three different kinds of love, I think. And one is the commando who goes to train in this new top secret kind of warfare. And he goes to train in Arizeg and meets someone there, and what happens to them. Then the second kind of love is the love of an adult for a child, the daughter of this commando, coming back from working with the Red Cross to confront a change in her own life. And the third one, I think, is an MI5 agent doing surveillance and discovering that that kind of life doesn't really suit her, and changing her perspective into the kind of love that sort of grounds her life. I haven't quite got her yet, as you can tell.
No.
But I'm very fascinated by there's a book called Soldier
Ooh,
Spy by Tom Marcus, that's a very
I've
interesting.
read it.
You have? Yeah, it's great.
Yeah. Yeah.
I
It's a sort
got
of
it.
modern day memoir, isn't
Yeah,
it?
it is about being a surveillance officer in the MI5. So thank you to Tom Marcus. I've taken a lot of material, or
Ah,
learnt a lot from
fantastic.
him. Yeah.
Oh, well, you please could you come back and talk about
Of
it when
course
it's
I will.
ready? Splendid. I found that book actually quite unnerving, and then I thought, oh God, I definitely wouldn't want to be an MI5.
No, and it's unnerving too. Not only the details of how he does it all and what happens, is how much of it is going on that we have no idea about. And it must be tripled by now at the moment, given the unrest at the moment and this international scenario, and how it must break those operatives' lives, really.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, we only ever hear about the sort of successful terrorist attacks and all those ones, the sort of 99% that these guys are stopping. Oh, this has been very enjoyable.
Oh, I love
Thank
talking.
you very much.
Pleasure.
And yes, I look forward to speaking again for Three Times Love.
Thank you very, very much.
Thanks so much for listening. Plenty more history on the way, including the Battle of the Bulge, Richard II and Henry IV, and this month's film club, Apocalypse Now. So until then, thank you and good night.